Pastor Jonathan Myers stood behind the glass pulpit of Grace Harbor Church, his voice rolling across 3,000 seats like a wave rehearsed 100 times. "Church," he said, spreading his arms, "today we talk about the least of these. Today we talk about how Jesus himself said, 'Whatever you do for the poor, the forgotten, the broken, you do unto him.'" The congregation murmured its approval. Hands lifted. Someone in the front row wiped a tear. Behind the last pew, a woman in a torn gray coat shifted her weight from one aching foot to the other. Her shoes were held together with tape. Her hair, once dark, had gone the color of ash. She clutched a small cloth bag to her chest, like it held the last thing she owned in the world. Because it did. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, though nobody in that building knew it yet. She had walked 2 miles in the cold to be there. She had waited outside the doors for 20 minutes, working up the courage to step inside a place that gleamed with marble floors and chandeliers, a place that did not look like it belonged to the God she remembered. An usher had let her in reluctantly. She had taken a seat in the very back, folded her hands, and closed her eyes, letting the pastor's voice wash over her like something almost familiar. Then Richard Cole, the head of the board, leaned toward Pastor Jonathan's ear during the closing hymn and whispered 4 words that would detonate everything. "We have investors watching." Jonathan's smile didn't waver, but his eyes moved, just once, toward the back row, toward the woman in the torn coat, sitting among families in pressed suits and children in patent leather shoes. The hymn ended. Jonathan stepped down from the platform, still smiling for the cameras live streaming the service to 40,000 online viewers, and walked the long aisle with practiced grace until he reached her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, kindly, the microphone on his lapel still live, still broadcasting. "I think you might be more comfortable at the shelter on 5th Street. We have a van that can take you." Eleanor opened her eyes. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Not embarrassment, not shame, but a strange, quiet sorrow, as if she had expected this, and it still hurt. "I only wanted to hear the sermon," she said softly. "Of course," Jonathan said, his voice syrup smooth for the cameras. "But this service it's for our members and their guests today. We have some very important visitors." 2 security guards appeared at her sides before she even stood. 3,000 people watched. 40,000 more watched online. Somewhere in the 3rd row, a young usher named David Reyes felt his stomach drop into his shoes. Eleanor Whitfield rose slowly, gathered her small bag, and let herself be walked to the doors of a church that, 31 years earlier, had been built with her husband's bare hands and her husband's entire fortune. She said nothing else. She simply looked back once, at the golden cross above the altar, at the man in the expensive suit who did not recognize her, and walked out into the cold. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, David Reyes had heard that verse every Sunday. For 11 years. He was about to learn what it actually meant. David Reyes was 26 years old, and he had been sweeping the floors of Grace Harbor Church since he was 15. He didn't remember a version of his life without this building. His mother had brought him here after his father left, back when Grace Harbor was a modest brick chapel with folding chairs, and a pastor named Elias Myers, Jonathan's father, who used to greet every single visitor by name before they even introduced themselves. David remembered Pastor Elias kneeling down to his eye level once, when David was 16 and angry at the world, and saying, "Son, this church isn't the building. It's what you do for the person nobody else will look at." Pastor Elias died when David was 21. Jonathan took over the pulpit 6 months later, and within 3 years, Grace Harbor had transformed. Bigger sanctuary, valet parking, a media team, a 5-year vision plan to build a satellite campus in the wealthy side of town. Attendance tripled. So did the offering plates. David told himself the growth was a blessing. He told himself the valet parking, and the security guards, and the VIP guest seating for major donors were just modern necessities. He told himself a lot of things, because he loved this church the way you love a childhood home, even after it's been renovated into something you don't recognize. He worked 3 other jobs to make rent, and still showed up every Sunday at 6 a.m. to set up chairs, run cables, and greet people at the door. Not because anyone paid him to, but because it was the only way he knew how to say thank you to a place that had once been the only stable thing in his life. He was hardworking. He was trusted. He was the kind of person who noticed things other people didn't, like the way certain guests were escorted to reserved seating up front, while others were quietly steered toward the back. Like the way Richard Cole, the board chairman, had started reviewing the guest list before every big service. For security purposes, David told himself it didn't mean anything, until the Sunday a homeless woman in a torn gray coat walked through the doors, and he watched his pastor walk her right back out. He had stood near the aisle that morning, cables in his hands, and watched Jonathan Myers, the man he's looked up to since he was a teenager, smile for the live stream cameras, while 2 guards walked an old woman into the cold. Something in David's chest cracked that day, not loudly, quietly, like the first hairline fracture in a piece of glass, the kind you don't notice until the whole thing shatters. He didn't say anything that Sunday. He told himself he must be missing context. He told himself Pastor Jonathan must have had a good reason. But that night, lying awake in his small apartment, David kept replaying the woman's face, the way she hadn't argued, hadn't cried, hadn't even seemed surprised, like being turned away was simply something she had learned to expect from the world. And he kept thinking about something Pastor Elias used to say, back when David was young and the church was small. David, always pay attention to the people everyone else looks past. God usually hides the most important lessons inside the people we're most tempted to ignore. David didn't know it yet, but that sentence was about to become the most important warning of his life. David's mother, Lucia, had raised him alone in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, working double shifts as a home health aide so he could stay in the same school district through high school. Grace Harbor had been the one constant in a childhood otherwise defined by instability. The same pew every Sunday, the same potluck every 3rd Saturday, the same soft-spoken man in the pulpit who somehow always remembered David's name, his grades, his troubles, without ever needing to be reminded. When David was 19, his mother's health began to fail, and it was the church's old benevolence fund, quietly, without paperwork or lectures, that covered 2 months of her medication when his paychecks couldn't stretch far enough. He never forgot that. It was, in his mind, proof of exactly what a church was supposed to do: notice the person who was struggling, and help before being asked. That was part of why the last 3 years had unsettled him so deeply, in ways he'd been unwilling to name, even to himself. He'd watched the benevolence fund shrink, year after year, watched the sign-up sheet for financial counseling replaced by a slicker, more selective financial wellness screening process that somehow always seemed to approve fewer people than it used to. He'd watched Richard Cole introduce the term guest experience protocol in a staff meeting 18 months earlier, watched half the room nod along as though it were simply common sense, and told himself, again, that he must be missing something the adults in the room understood better than he did. He was 26 years old, still sweeping floors for free, still trusting the people who'd raised him in faith, and still, in the quietest part of himself, waiting for someone to prove that trust wasn't misplaced. Eleanor Whitfield was about to test that trust in ways David never could have anticipated. You did for me. Eleanor Whitfield had spent her whole life giving to people who would never know her name. That Sunday, she was finally asking for something back. Just 5 minutes. To sit and listen. She was refused even that. 34 years earlier, Eleanor Whitfield had been a young bride with dirt under her fingernails and calluses on her palms, standing beside her husband Samuel on a patch of empty land at the edge of town, watching him drive the first wooden stake into the ground. Samuel Whitfield was a carpenter, not a wealthy man by the standards of the world, but a man who had inherited a small piece of land from his own father, land that, by pure and unglamorous luck, sat on a plot that would one day be worth a fortune. Samuel didn't care about the money. He cared about the small, struggling congregation that met in his living room every Sunday, led by a young, earnest preacher named Elias Myers, who couldn't afford a building of his own. Take the land, Samuel told Elias one evening, pressing the deed into his hands. "Build something. Just promise me one thing." "Anything," Elias said. "Promise me that whoever walks through those doors, rich or poor, clean or dirty, welcome anywhere else or welcome nowhere else, they get to sit down and hear the word, no matter what they look like, no matter what they can give." Elias had wept and promised. Samuel had spent the next 2 years building the original chapel with his own hands, using his own tools, refusing every offer of payment. Eleanor stood beside him through every board and every nail, mixing mortar, hauling lumber, feeding the volunteers who came to help. They named it Grace Harbor, a harbor of grace for anyone who needed shelter from the storm of their own life. Samuel died 11 years later of a heart condition that had gone undiagnosed because they'd spent every spare dollar helping others instead of seeing doctors. Eleanor never remarried. She had no children of her own, a private grief she carried quietly, never burdening anyone with it. And in the decades that followed, she poured what little she had into the community around her, tutoring neighborhood children for free, cooking meals for elderly shut-ins, mending clothes for families who couldn't afford new ones. She never asked to be thanked. She never asked to be remembered. When Pastor Elias grew old, he would still call her every few months, just to check on her, just to say, "Eleanor, you built more of this church than anyone with their name on a plaque." She always laughed it off. "You built it, Elias. I just held the ladder." But somewhere over the last 15 years, life had quietly dismantled everything Eleanor had. A modest pension that didn't stretch far enough, a small apartment lost to a rent increase she couldn't meet, a body that no longer let her work the way she used to. She never told anyone how bad it had gotten, not out of pride, but because she had spent her whole life being the person who helped, and she didn't know how to become the person who needed help. The decline had not happened all at once. It had happened the way most quiet tragedies happen, in small, almost survivable increments, each one seeming manageable on its own, until suddenly they weren't. First, it was the part-time seamstress work drying up, when the shop she'd sewn for 2 decades closed. Then it was a knee that needed surgery she couldn't afford, leaving her walking slower, unable to take the cleaning jobs that had once supplemented her pension. Then it was the rent increase, modest by the landlord's account, catastrophic by hers, that ate the last cushion she had left. She sold what she could. She asked no one for help because the people she might have asked had, one by one, drifted out of her life over the decades, the way people do when you have nothing left to offer them but your company. She thought, more than once during those hardest months, of calling the church, of calling Pastor Elias's old number, even though she knew he'd been gone for years now, just to hear if anyone still remembered her name there. She never made the call. Some stubborn, weathered part of her told her that Samuel would not have wanted her walking through those doors asking for charity, not when he'd given everything he had, to make sure that building would still be standing, for people who needed exactly that kind of help. She never let herself think of it as her own charity coming back around. That thought, when it occasionally surfaced, felt too much like keeping score with God, and Eleanor had never once, in 34 years, kept score with God. 6 months before that fateful Sunday, Eleanor Whitfield had been sleeping in her car. 2 months before that, the car had been repossessed. She still walked past Grace Harbor Church every week, the church with the golden cross and the valet parking now, unrecognizable from the chapel she'd helped nail together board by board. And every week, something in her ached to go inside, not for charity, not for a meal. She simply wanted, one more time, to sit in the building her husband had built with his own hands, and hear someone speak the words that had once meant everything to her. That Sunday, she finally worked up the courage. She had no idea the man preaching behind that glass pulpit was Elias Meyer's son. She had no idea he had never once been told her name, her sacrifice, or the promise his own father had made, standing on that empty plot of land 34 years before. All she knew was that she sat in the back row, closed her eyes, and, for 3 minutes, felt something like peace. Then, it was taken from her again. In the weeks before that Sunday, Eleanor had developed a small, private ritual to survive the days. Each morning, she walked to the public library, not to check out books, but because it was warm, and because the librarian, a patient woman named Denise, let her sit by the window for hours, without asking questions. Each afternoon, she walked the 2 miles to a soup kitchen that served a modest lunch at noon, timing her arrival carefully so she wouldn't be one of the first in line, wouldn't take a spot from someone who might need it more. Each night, she found whatever shelter she could, a covered bus stop, a 24-hour laundromat, once, memorably and gratefully, the back pew of a different church that left its doors unlocked for exactly this purpose. She had learned, over the years, an entire quiet language of survival that most people never have to learn. Which doorways stayed dry in the rain, which businesses would let her use a restroom without a purchase, which strangers' faces meant kindness, and which meant she should keep walking. She had learned to make herself small, unremarkable, forgettable, not out of shame, but because the world had taught her, again and again, that being noticed usually meant being asked to leave. And yet, some stubborn ember in her refused to fully surrender to invisibility. She still combed her hair every morning, with a broken plastic comb she kept wrapped in a handkerchief. She still said please and thank you to everyone she met, even when they didn't look at her long enough to hear it. She still, on the anniversary of Samuel's death every March, found a way to buy a single flower from a grocery store and leave it somewhere quiet, in his memory, even in years when buying that flower meant going without dinner. That Sunday morning, walking toward Grace Harbor Church, Eleanor had worn her best coat, the least torn one, and had spent nearly 20 minutes at the Summay library restroom sink that morning, trying to make herself look presentable enough not to draw attention. She had told herself, walking those 2 miles in the cold, that she deserved, at the very least, one quiet hour inside the walls her husband had built, to remember who she used to be, before the world had worn her down to who she'd become. She had not expected kindness. She had learned not to expect it. But she had not expected, either, to be walked out in front of 3,000 people and 40,000 cameras, treated like a stain on a program someone else was trying to keep clean. What she felt walking out those doors was not simply humiliation. It was something deeper and older. The particular grief of watching something you built with your own hands, something you sacrificed everything for, become a place that no longer recognized you, or the values you'd poured into its very foundation. Jonathan Myers could quote Matthew 25 without looking at his notes. He had built an entire ministry brand around radical compassion. The gap between what a man preaches and what a man practices is where every tragedy in this story begins. Jonathan Myers had not always been a bad man. That's an important thing to understand, because villains in real life rarely start out as villains. They start out as men who make one small compromise, and then another, till one day they wake up and don't recognize the shape of their own soul. Jonathan grew up in the shadow of his father's humility, and hated it. In the quiet way children sometimes hate the very virtues they're child, later spend their whole lives chasing the opposite of. Elias Myers had turned down television deals, turned down wealthy donors who wanted naming rights on buildings, turned down every opportunity that might have made Grace Harbor bigger, because he believed bigger wasn't the point. Jonathan believed bigger was exactly the point. When his father died and left him the pulpit, Jonathan inherited a church of 800 devoted members and a mortgage-free building. Within 18 months, he'd hired a media consultant, rebranded the church's visual identity, and begun preaching a series called Kingdom Increase that framed financial blessing as spiritual reward. Attendance exploded. So did the budget. Richard Cole arrived not long after, a former real estate developer who joined the board, promising to help Jonathan professionalize the ministry. Richard was the kind of man who spoke in numbers, engagement rates, giving trends, brand alignment. He was also the kind of man who, within his first year on the board, quietly introduced the idea of a guest experience protocol, a soft, bureaucratic phrase for something much uglier, a system for identifying which visitors reflected well on the church's image and which ones didn't. At first, it was small things. A homeless man was gently redirected to sit near the exit for easier access to the parking lot. A woman in stained clothes was offered a welcome gift bag at the door instead of a seat inside. A family who arrived in an old, rattling car was greeted less warmly than the family who arrived in a Mercedes. Jonathan told himself none of it was really about class or money. He told himself it was about stewardship, protecting the donor relationships that funded the church's outreach programs. The very programs that, ironically, were supposed to help people exactly like the ones being quietly turned away. He never noticed the contradiction. That was the most dangerous part. Claire Myers noticed it before almost anyone. In the early years of Jonathan's ministry, she had been his fiercest supporter, sitting through late nights of sermon writing, celebrating every milestone of the church's growth as though it were their shared life's work, which, in many ways, it was. But somewhere around year 4, she began noticing small things that unsettled her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The way Jonathan's assistant now pre-screened which congregants got personal meetings with him based on their giving history. The way strategic hospitality had become an actual line item in the church's annual budget. The way Jonathan, once able to recite the names and stories of half the congregation from memory, now needed briefing notes before greeting his own members. She raised it with him once, quietly, over dinner. "Do you ever miss when it was smaller?" she asked. "When you knew everyone's name because you actually knew them, not because someone printed it on a card for you." Jonathan had laughed it off. "Claire, we're helping more people now than my father ever could. That's not something to feel guilty about." "I didn't say guilty," Claire said carefully. "I said I miss it." The conversation ended there, the way so many of their conversations had begun ending in recent years, not in conflict, but in a kind of quiet, mutual avoidance, each of them sensing a widening gap between the man Jonathan had been and the man he was, becoming, neither quite ready to name it out loud. By the time Eleanor Whitfield walked through Grace Harbor's doors that Sunday, Jonathan Myers had preached over 400 sermons about compassion for the poor, and personally overseen the quiet removal of at least a dozen people who didn't fit the image his precious church was trying to sell, to a room full of major investors funding a $40 million campus expansion. That particular Sunday mattered more than most. 3 of the church's largest potential donors, a real estate group considering funding the new campus, were seated in the front section, and Richard Cole had made it very clear before the service. Nothing unpredictable today, Jonathan. Nothing that makes people uncomfortable. This is the day that decides whether we build. When Jonathan saw Eleanor Whitfield sitting quietly in the back row, he didn't see a woman. He saw a variable, a risk. A wrinkle in a carefully pressed presentation. He didn't know her name. He didn't know his own father had built that church on a promise never to do exactly what he was about to do. He only knew that Richard Cole was watching, the cameras were rolling, and the deal was worth $40 million. So, he smiled his warmest smile, and he walked her out. There was a version of that Sunday morning that existed only in Jonathan's head, one he replayed obsessively over the following days, trying to convince himself it had been reasonable. In that version, he was protecting 100 future beneficiaries of the campus expansion by managing one uncomfortable moment. In that version, Eleanor Whitfield was an unfortunate casualty of a bigger, nobler calculation. In that version, he was still the good man he told himself he was. Every time he stepped behind that glass pulpit, he did not let himself examine the other version, the one where a frightened old woman had simply wanted to sit quietly in a church, and he had chosen the comfort of wealthy strangers over her, not because the math truly required it, but because it was easier, faster, and less likely to cost him anything personally. That night, alone in his study, surrounded by leadership books with his own face on several of their back covers, Jonathan poured himself a drink he told himself he didn't really need, and stared at a framed photograph of his father breaking ground on the original chapel decades earlier. Elias Myers, thin and unremarkable in a plain button-down shirt, grinning in front of a hand-lettered sign that read, "Grace Harbor, all are welcome." Asterisk, "You'd have hated everything I built," Jonathan said quietly to the photograph. And for just a moment, something like grief moved through him, quickly suppressed, quickly rationalized, the way he had learned to suppress and rationalize so much else over the last several years. He thought that was the end of it. He had no idea it was only the beginning. "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name, welcomes me." Nobody in that church knew Eleanor Whitfield's name. Somebody was about to find it, and it would change everything. The video of Eleanor being escorted out went online within the hour, clipped from the church's own live stream by a viewer who'd been uneasy watching it happen live. By Sunday evening, it had 40,000 views. By Monday morning, it had 400,000. The comments were brutal. This is the opposite of everything he just preached. Rich church, poor theology. She just wanted to sit down. That's it. Jonathan's media team scrambled. Richard Cole called an emergency meeting Monday afternoon in the church's glass-walled conference room, the same room where they'd once mapped out the $40 million campus expansion on a whiteboard now hastily wiped clean. This is a PR problem, Richard said flatly, not a moral one. Let's not confuse the two. She was a guest, David Reyes said quietly from the corner of the room, where he'd been asked to sit in as the staff perspective. A token gesture Richard clearly regretted the moment David opened his mouth. She wasn't a threat. She wasn't disruptive. She was just poor. The room went silent. Richard's jaw tightened. David, Jonathan said, his voice carefully even, we appreciate your heart, but you don't understand what's at stake. That expansion funds 3 shelters, a food pantry, and a job training program for people exactly like her. If we lose those donors over an optics issue, we lose the ability to help 100 times more people than her. David wanted to believe that math. He wanted to believe the ends justified turning one woman out into the cold. But something about it didn't sit right, and he couldn't yet name what. So, what's the plan? Richard asked, steering the conversation back to strategy. A statement, Jonathan said. We apologize for any miscommunication. We say she wasn't asked to leave the church, just relocated to a more comfortable seating area, and there was an unfortunate misunderstanding with security. We invite her back publicly. Good press. Problem solved. And if she comes back? David asked. Jonathan smiled, the same practice smile from the live stream. Then we roll out the red carpet. Photo op. Everybody wins. Before the meeting broke up, one of the older elders, a soft-spoken man named Walter Higgins, who had served under Pastor Elias for nearly 20 years before Jonathan took over, cleared his throat. Can I ask something? Walter said. Of course, Jonathan said, a flicker of impatience crossing his face. Did anyone actually ask her name before she was walked out? Walter asked. Did anyone offer her a seat somewhere else in the sanctuary? Or just walked her all the way outside? The room shifted uncomfortably. Nobody answered immediately. The guards were following protocol, Richard said finally. We can review the protocol. That's not what I asked, Walter said quietly. And for a moment, something like the old church, the one built on handshakes and casseroles instead of quarterly giving reports, flickered briefly back to life in that glass conference room. Nobody responded to him directly. The meeting moved on to talking points and social media strategy, and Walter Higgins sat back in his chair, quietly disappointed, the way a man gets when he already suspects the answer to a question he's good. It's just watched everyone avoid. David left that meeting with a knot in his stomach he couldn't untangle. It wasn't the apology that bothered him, it was the word problem. Eleanor Whitfield wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a person who had been humiliated on camera in front of tens of thousands of people, and the response wasn't remorse. It was damage control. That night, David did something he'd never done before. He drove to the shelter on 5th Street, the one Jonathan had mentioned from the pulpit, hoping to find the woman and personally apologize on behalf of a church that clearly wasn't going to mean it. She wasn't there. The shelter director, a tired but kind woman named Marisol, told him, "We don't have anyone matching that description registered here. Whoever she is, she never came." "Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" David asked. Marisol shook her head slowly. "Son, there are people in this city who've been failed so many times, they stop going anywhere that might fail them again. If she didn't come here, it's because she didn't trust it would be different." David sat in his car outside the shelter for a long time that night, staring at the church skyline in his rearview mirror, the golden cross glowing under floodlights in the distance. He thought about Pastor Elias kneeling down to his eye level years ago. Always pay attention to the people everyone else looks past. He didn't know it yet, but 40 miles away, in a small motel room paid for with the last of her savings, Eleanor Whitfield was sitting on the edge of a sagging bed, holding an old photograph of a man with sawdust on his hands and a smile full of pride, looking at a half-built chapel behind him. She was making a decision. She was going back. Earlier that same day, David had gone to see his mother, Lucia, hoping her steady wisdom might untangle the knot in his chest. He found her at her kitchen table, sorting old photographs into shoeboxes, and told her everything. The woman in the gray coat, the meeting in the glass conference room, the word problem that Jonathan had used, and that David couldn't shake. Lucia listened without interrupting, the way she always had, and when he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "David," she said, "when you were small, and we had nothing, do you remember what kept us standing? It wasn't the sermons. It wasn't the building. It was the way certain people in that church looked at us like we mattered, even when we had nothing to offer them. That's the whole religion, mijo. Everything else is decoration." "What do I do if the decoration's taken over the religion?" David asked. Lucia squeezed his hand. "Then you become one of the people who still remembers what the religion was supposed to look like. Sometimes that's all one person can do, but one person remembering is how everything eventually gets remembered again." David left his mother's, Joss's apartment that night, with her words settled somewhere deep in his chest. A small, steady flame he would need in the days ahead, though he didn't yet know how much he'd need it. "They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." Grace Harbor's apology went out on every platform within 48 hours. It said all the right words. It meant almost none of them. The public apology posted Tuesday morning was, by every professional metric, a masterpiece. Grace Harbor Church is deeply saddened by the events of this past Sunday. "We fell short of our values of radical hospitality and welcome, and for that, we sincerely apologize to the woman involved and to our entire community. We are committed to becoming a church where every person, regardless of circumstance, feels seen, valued, and welcomed." We invite her back with open arms. It received glowing praise from half the internet and bitter skepticism from the other half. Local news picked up the story. A reporter named Angela Ruiz from the city paper reached out requesting an interview with Pastor Jonathan, which Richard Cole flatly denied on his behalf, issuing instead a second carefully worded statement about focusing on healing rather than media attention. Angela didn't give up. On Wednesday, she published a piece titled, "Who Was the Woman Grace Harbor Turned Away?" A piece that, despite having no real answer to its own headline, generated over 200,000 shares and a level of public scrutiny the church's media team had clearly not anticipated. Comment sections filled with a strange mixture of outrage and grief. Strangers online, sharing their own stories of being made to feel unwelcome in churches that preach the opposite from the pulpit. Internally, the mood shifted from mild embarrassment to something closer to quiet panic. Richard Cole began holding twice-daily strategy calls with the media team. Jonathan, uncharacteristically, missed a scheduled podcast recording that Tuesday, citing a family matter that David privately suspected didn't exist. 2 junior staff members quietly resigned within the week, unwilling to continue working under what one of them, in a hallway conversation with David, called a church that apologizes better than it behaves. Behind closed doors, the tone was very different. "The Whitmore Group is spooked," Richard told Jonathan privately, referring to the real estate investors behind the $40 million campus deal. "They're asking if this is going to become an ongoing controversy. I told them absolutely not. I told them this is handled." "It is handled," Jonathan said, though his voice carried less confidence than his words. "Is it? Because half the comments on that apology post are asking why we don't know her name, why we don't know anything about her. It looks like we don't even care enough to ask." "We'll find her," Jonathan said. "We'll do the photo op. It'll be fine." But finding her proved harder than expected. Grace Harbor's staff called every shelter within a 20-mile radius. Nobody had a record of an Eleanor, or any elderly woman matching her description, checking in that week. It was as though she had deliberately vanished, which, in a way, she had. Eleanor Whitfield had spent 30 years being invisible to the world by circumstance. She knew, better than anyone, how to disappear when she needed to. Meanwhile, David Reyes had started noticing something strange in the church's financial reports. Reports he technically wasn't supposed to have access to, but which had been left open on a shared office computer he used to print event materials. A recurring monthly donation, small but consistent, made anonymously for the past 15 years under the label "A Friend of the Founder," designated specifically and unusually for the church's benevolence fund. The fund meant to help members in financial crisis, a fund that, David had noticed over the last year, had been quietly shrinking as more and more of the budget shifted toward the new campus expansion. He didn't think much of it at first. Anonymous donors weren't unusual, but then he noticed the donation had stopped. 8 months ago, right around the time he'd later learn that Eleanor Whitfield lost her apartment. David filed the detail away in the back of his mind, a loose thread he didn't yet know how to pull. He didn't have to wait long to find out. That Thursday, Eleanor Whitfield walked back into Grace Harbor Church, not during a service this time, but on a quiet weekday afternoon, when the sanctuary was empty except for a cleaning crew and David, sweeping the same floors he always swept. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she spoke. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I used to know this building a long time ago. Is there any way I could speak with whoever handles the church's history, its records?" David set down his broom slowly, recognizing her instantly from the video that had played on Relk. Every screen in the city for the last 3 days. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "Are you the woman from Sunday?" Eleanor's eyes flickered with something like surprise, then quiet resignation. "I suppose word travels fast. I'm so sorry about what happened," David said, and he meant every word of it. "That should never have happened to you. Please, can I get you something? Water? Coffee? A seat?" For the first time since she'd walked through those doors 6 days earlier, someone had offered Eleanor Whitfield something without asking what she could give in return. She almost cried. "Water would be lovely, thank you," she said, lowering herself carefully into a folding chair near the sanctuary wall. David hurried to fetch a cup, and when he returned, she wrapped both hands around it as though the warmth of the paper cup itself mattered as much as the water inside. "I've walked past this building every week for months," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I never had the courage to come back in. Not until last Sunday." "Why now?" David asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. Eleanor considered the question for a long moment. "Because I'm tired, David. Tired of watching something I love from the outside, wondering if it still remembers what it was for. I thought maybe it was time to find out, one way or another." David didn't know, in that moment, exactly who he was speaking with, or how much the coming days would change because of it. He only knew that something about this woman's quiet dignity, the careful way she held her cup, the exhaustion behind her eyes that no amount of politeness could fully hide, made him want to help her, not out of obligation, not because his job required it, but because some part of him recognized, without yet understanding why, that she mattered more than anyone at Grace Harbor currently understood. "Actually," she said, straightening slightly, a flicker of the old strength returning to her spine, "I'd like to see the church's original deed records, if you have them." David blinked. "The deed records?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I have reason to believe I'm named on them, for nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed. Every church keeps records. Most people never think to read them." David Reyes was about to read the one document that would unravel Grace Harbor's carefully built image. David led Eleanor to the small administrative office at the back of the building. A cramped room, lined with filing cabinets that hadn't been touched in years, tucked behind the media team's sleek new studio. "I have to be honest," David said, pulling open a drawer marked Historical, pre-wine 9-95. "I don't even know what's in here. Most of our records are digital now. This is just old stuff nobody's looked at in a while." "That's all right," Eleanor said. "Some things are supposed to wait for the right moment to be found." It took nearly 40 minutes of searching through yellowed folders before David's fingers landed on a thin manila envelope labeled, in faded blue ink, "Original Deed, Grace Harbor Chapel, 1992. He handed it to her without opening it, some instinct telling him it wasn't his to open first. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the brittle paper inside. Her eyes moved across the text. Legal language, property boundaries, notarized signatures, until they landed on a name at the bottom, beside her husband's. "Property transferred by Samuel J. Whitfield, in partnership with Eleanor M. Whitfield, to Elias R. Myers, for the sole and continuing purpose of establishing a house of worship open to all." persons regardless of means, under the binding condition that no person seeking entry shall be denied access on account of poverty, appearance, or inability to contribute financially. Violation of this condition shall constitute grounds for reversion of the property to the Whitfield estate or its lawful heirs. David read it over her shoulder and felt the floor tilt beneath him. Wait, he said slowly. This says, if the church ever turns someone away for being poor, the land goes back to the Whitfield family. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening. My husband built this church with his own hands. He believed so deeply that a house of God should never turn away the very people God asked us to care for, that he wrote it into the deed itself. Elias, the pastor before this one, he promised. He signed it. He meant it. You're Eleanor Whitfield, David said, the pieces clicking together. You're the reason this church exists at all. I'm the reason it existed, Eleanor corrected gently. What it's become, I don't recognize anymore. David sat down heavily in the office chair, his mind racing. Does Pastor Jonathan know about this clause? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. Elias may never have told him, or Jonathan may have simply forgotten it existed, the way people forget promises that stop being convenient. This is huge, David said. If this is legally binding, if what happened Sunday actually violates this condition, then, legally the church could— I'm not here to take anyone's church, David, Eleanor interrupted, quiet but firm. I never wanted the land back. I gave it away because I believed in what it could become. I came back this week for one reason only. I wanted to know if the promise my husband died, believing in still, meant anything to anybody. She folded the deed carefully and placed it back in its envelope. But now that I know the truth, she added, and for the first time, something steel-edged entered her voice. I think it's time the whole congregation learns it too. David looked at her, a slow understanding dawning in his chest. Not fear, but something closer to hope. The kind he hadn't let himself feel about this place in a long time. There's a big anniversary service this Sunday, he said. The whole congregation will be there. The donors, too. Pastor Jonathan's doing a special address about the campus expansion. Before Eleanor left the small administrative office that afternoon, David asked if he could dig further, curiosity now thoroughly overtaking caution. Beneath the deed, in the same manila folder, he found a second document, a handwritten letter, dated 18 years earlier. In a shaky but determined hand, David immediately recognized. From old bulletins and newsletters as belonging to Pastor Elias Myers. The letter was addressed simply, to be read by my son, when he is ready. David hesitated, the letter feeling too private, too sacred, to read without permission. He looked at Eleanor. It's not addressed to us, he said quietly. No, Eleanor agreed, but I suspect it explains a great deal. And I suspect your pastor has never read it, or he wouldn't be the man we met last Sunday. They did not open it that day. David placed it carefully back into the folder, promising himself he would find the right moment to bring it to Jonathan directly. Not as a weapon, but as a gift his pastor had somehow never been given. Eleanor stood slowly, steadying herself against the edge of the desk, 34 years of memory suddenly heavy in her body. David, she said, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Do you think this church can still become what it was supposed to be? Or has too much time passed? David thought about it seriously before answering, unwilling to offer her false comfort. I think, he finally said, that buildings don't forget what they were built for, even when the people running them do. I think that's what the deed is, really. It's the building remembering, even when everyone else stopped. Eleanor smiled, the first full smile David had seen from her since they'd met. Your pastor Elias would have liked you very much. He used to kneel down to talk to me when I was a kid, David said. I forgot that, for a while. I think I'm starting to remember. Eleanor's eyes met his. Then that sounds like exactly the right place to speak. You have heard it said, but I tell you, every sermon has a version the pastor plans, and sometimes, a version God has planned instead. This Sunday, Grace Harbor was about to get both. News of Eleanor Whitfield's identity did not stay contained. David, torn between loyalty to the institution that raised him and loyalty to what he now understood was right, made a decision that would define the rest of the week. He told Pastor Jonathan the truth. He expected shock. He expected, perhaps foolishly, remorse. What he got instead was calculation. "You're telling me," Jonathan said slowly, sitting behind his desk in his office, the $40 million campus renderings still pinned to the wall behind him, "that the woman we removed from the sanctuary is the same Eleanor Whitfield whose husband originally donated this land?" "Yes," David said, "and there's a reversion clause in the original deed. If the church denies entry to someone based on poverty, the land can legally revert to her family." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, businesslike, nothing like the warm cadence he used from the pulpit. "Does she have a lawyer?" David blinked. "What? No, that's not. She's not trying to sue anyone, Jonathan. She just wants—" "Does Richard know about this?" Jonathan cut in. "No, I came to you first." "Good," Jonathan said, standing, already moving toward the door. "Keep it that way. Let me handle this." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Handle it? How?" Jonathan turned back, and for a brief, unguarded moment, David saw something in his pastor's face he'd never seen before. Not compassion, not guilt, but fear. Naked, self-preserving fear. "David," Jonathan said quietly, "if this gets out before the Whitmore deal closes Friday, we lose everything. The campus, the shelters, the job programs, all of it. I need you to trust me. I will make this right with Mrs. Whitfield privately, quietly. I'll take care of her financially. I'll apologize personally. I'll do whatever it takes. But it cannot become a public spectacle at Sunday's service. Do you understand me?" "You mean you don't want it to become public before your investors sign?" David said slowly. "This was never about her. It's still not about her. It's about the deal. It's about protecting everything my father built." Jonathan snapped, his composure finally cracking. "You think I don't know what he wanted this church to be? I grew up in his shadow, David. I know exactly what he wanted. But wanting something and being able to pay for it are two different things. This expansion isn't for me. It's for the thousands of people we can help that my father, with his little chapel and his little promises, never could." David studied him for a long moment. "Then why does it matter if Eleanor Whitfield tells her story on Sunday? If your intentions are as good as you say, the truth shouldn't scare you." Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was the answer. That night, Richard Cole found out anyway, because Jonathan, panicking, had called him the moment David left his office. And Richard, ever the strategist, had a very different solution than handling it quietly. "We get ahead of it," Richard said over the phone. "We invite her to Sunday's service ourselves. Front row seat. We make a public show of welcoming her back. Flowers, an apology from the pulpit, maybe a small check for her trouble. We control the narrative before she has the chance to control it herself." "And if she wants to speak?" Jonathan asked. "Then we give her 2 minutes, thank her warmly, and move straight into the campus vision. Announcement before anyone has time to ask hard questions," Richard said. "Trust me, Jonathan. I've managed 100 PR situations messier than this. We turn her into our redemption story instead of our scandal." It was, on paper, a clever plan. David, meanwhile, drove straight from Jonathan's office to the motel, still shaken by the conversation, unsure whether he'd just done the right thing or handed Eleanor's story to the very people most likely to bury it. He found her sitting by the window, the way she often did, watching the parking lot lights flicker on as evening settled over the city. "I told him," David said. "I told Jonathan everything. About you, about the deed." Eleanor didn't seem surprised. "And?" "He asked if you had a lawyer," David said, still turning the moment over uneasily in his mind. "Before he asked if you were okay, before he asked your name again, or how you were doing, or anything human at all, he asked about legal exposure." Eleanor nodded slowly, as though confirming something she'd already suspected. "That tells you what you needed to know, doesn't it?" "I think I already knew," David admitted. "I think I've known for a while, and I just didn't want to." "That's all right," Eleanor said gently. "Most people don't want to know the truth about someone they've trusted for a long time. It's not weakness, David. It's grief, arriving early, before you've had the chance to name it yet." David sat down across from her, the small motel room quiet, except for the hum of a nearby vending machine. "What happens now?" "Now," Eleanor said, folding her hands in her lap with the same quiet steadiness. "She Tarcha, carried through every conversation since they'd met. We let Sunday happen exactly the way it's meant to. Whatever plan they've made in that office tonight, David, it was never going to survive contact with the truth. Plans like that never do. They had no idea that Eleanor Whitfield had spent 30 years of her life building things with far more permanence than a media strategy, and that this Sunday, she had no intention of playing the redemption story they'd written for her. She had one of her own. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people, to be seen by them. Grace Harbor's invitation to Eleanor looked like grace. Underneath it was strategy. The difference between the two was about to become impossible to hide. On Friday, 2 days before the anniversary service, a young member of the church's hospitality team arrived at the modest motel where David had carefully, respectfully, helped Eleanor arrange temporary lodging, this time paid for quietly by David himself, out of his own thin savings, not by the church. The hospitality coordinator carried a gift basket, a handwritten card from Pastor Jonathan, and an invitation, gold embossed, to attend Sunday's 10th anniversary celebration service as an honored guest, with a reserved seat in the second row. Eleanor read the card slowly. Mrs. Whitfield, we are deeply sorry for the pain we caused. We would be honored to welcome you back this Sunday as we celebrate 10 years of growth and grace. Please allow us the opportunity to make things right, publicly and sincerely. With love, Pastor Jonathan Myers. Pastor Jonathan. She set the card down on the small motel table and looked at David, who had come along, feeling responsible somehow for whatever happened next. They know, she said quietly. Know what? That I'm Samuel's wife. That there's a reversion clause. She folded her hands in her lap. This isn't an apology, David. This is containment. David didn't argue, because he suspected she was right. Do you still want to go? He asked. Eleanor looked out the small motel window at the gray afternoon light, and for a long moment, she said nothing. When Samuel was building that chapel, she finally said, there was a week where the lumber supplier backed out on us, said he'd heard some folks in town thought we were building a shelter for troublemakers. Not a real church. Samuel didn't argue with them. He didn't fight. He just found another supplier, one town over, paid extra to have the wood delivered, and kept building. I asked him once why he never fought back when people doubted what we were building, and he said, Eleanor, you don't win people over by proving them wrong. You win them over by finishing what you started, so well that eventually, the truth speaks for itself. She turned back to David. I'm going to that service, she said. Not to fight. Not to take anything from anyone. I'm going because, on Sunday, in front of everyone, I intend to finish what my husband started 34 years ago, even if it means telling the truth about what this church has become in the meantime. David felt a chill run through him, not of fear, but of something closer to reverence. They're planning to give you 2 minutes at the podium, he warned her. Richard's going to try to control the moment, rush you off before you can say much. Eleanor's eyes, for the first time all week, carried the faintest trace of a smile. David, she said, I don't need very long to tell the truth. I only need long enough to say one sentence my husband wrote 34 years ago, and let the congregation decide for themselves what kind of church they want to be part of. That night, unbeknownst to either of them, Richard Cole was on the phone again, this time with the Whitmore Group's lead investor, smoothing over the last details of Friday's signed letter of intent, assuring them that Sunday's service will be a beautiful, controlled celebration of everything Grace Harbor stands for. Earlier that same evening, Richard had sat across from Jonathan in the church office, walking him through the choreography of Sunday morning with the precision of a man staging a play. She gets 2 minutes, maximum, Richard said, tapping a printed run of show sheet. You thank her, you present a token gift. I'm thinking a framed photo of the original chapel. Very sentimental, very shareable. And then you pivot straight into the campus vision video. If she tries to go long, the worship team starts the transition music. It's subtle. It works every time. And if she brings up the deed? Jonathan asked, the question he'd been avoiding all week finally surfacing. Richard's expression didn't change. She won't. She doesn't have a lawyer. She's an old woman who's been homeless for months, Jonathan. She wants to be seen, not sued. Give her the spotlight for 2 minutes. Let her feel heard. And this becomes the most talked about redemption story in the city, instead of a scandal. Trust the process. Jonathan nodded slowly, wanting badly to believe him, the way a drowning man wants badly to believe a piece of driftwood will hold his weight. He had no idea how wrong both of them were about to be. Search me, God, and know my heart. See if there is any offensive way in me. Before Sunday arrived, David went looking for one more piece of the truth. The piece that would explain why Pastor Elias's promise had been so completely forgotten by his own son. David couldn't shake one nagging question. If the deed's reversion clause was real, why had Jonathan never mentioned knowing about it? Not once. Not even in private conversations over the years about the church's history. Pastors don't usually forget the terms under which their own church's land was granted. He decided to ask the one person who might actually know. Miriam Okafor, the church's retired administrative assistant, who had worked under Pastor Elias for over 20 years, before retiring shortly after Jonathan took over. He found her at her home Saturday morning, sipping tea on her porch. Delighted and a little surprised to see him. "David Reyes," she said warmly. "Look how you've grown. Come in, come in." Over tea, David carefully explained everything. Eleanor, the deed, the reversion clause, Sunday's planned redemption service. Miriam's face changed as he spoke, moving from polite interest to something heavier, older, sadder. "I wondered if this day would ever come," she said quietly. "You knew about the clause?" "I knew about all of it," Miriam said. "Elias told me everything, back when I first started working for him. He was so proud of what Samuel and Eleanor had done for this church. He used to say Eleanor's name in his prayers every single Sunday before service, privately, before anyone arrived. He never forgot what he owed them. So why didn't he tell Jonathan?" Miriam sighed and set down her teacup. "He tried? Lord knows he tried. But Jonathan and his father had a complicated relationship. Jonathan resented how small Elias kept things. He thought his father's humility was a limitation, not a strength." Elias planned to formally introduce Jonathan to Eleanor and explain the full history of the deed on Jonathan's 30th birthday. Some kind of rite of passage, passing on the full weight of what the church really was, not just what it looked like. What happened? "Elias had his first stroke 3 weeks before that birthday," Miriam said softly. "He never fully recovered his speech after the second one. 2 years later, he died before he ever got the chance to tell Jonathan the whole truth. I tried to tell Jonathan myself, once, shortly after the funeral. He told me, kindly, but firmly, that the church's future needed to look forward, not backward. That he appreciated my loyalty to his father, but it was time for new leadership, new priorities." David sat back, stunned. So Jonathan genuinely might not know the full history. He might not even remember there's a legal clause in that deed. "He knows there's a clause," Miriam said carefully. "He signed off on refinancing paperwork years ago that referenced a historical restrictive covenant on the property. His lawyers flagged it, recommended getting it removed or amended. Jonathan told them not to worry about it, that it was sentimental language from an old agreement, nothing binding. I don't think he ever bothered to read exactly what it said. He didn't want to know," David said slowly, the picture sharpening in his mind, "because if he really understood what his father promised, he'd have had to actually keep it." Miriam nodded sadly. "Elias used to say something to me once, near the end, when his words were getting harder to find. He said, 'Miriam, a man can inherit a church. He can't inherit a conscience. That has to be built, brick by brick, same as the building was.' I think he knew, even then, that Jonathan hadn't finished building his." David left Miriam's porch that afternoon with a heavy, clarifying sadness. Jonathan wasn't simply a villain twirling a mustache. He was a man who had inherited an enormous responsibility and, instead of growing into it, had spent years, quietly, comfortably, avoiding it. Right up until the moment avoidance was no longer an option. That evening, David brought everything he'd learned back to Eleanor at the motel. Miriam's account of the unfinished conversation between father and son, the unread letter waiting in the archive, the 30th birthday revelation Elias never lived to deliver. He half expected the news to soften Eleanor's resolve, to make her reconsider speaking publicly at all, now that the full picture painted Jonathan less as a villain and more as a man failed by circumstance, and his own avoidance, in equal measure. Instead, Eleanor listened quietly, nodding slowly, her expression unreadable. Does this change what you're going to say tomorrow? David asked finally. No, Eleanor said. But it changes what I feel while I say it. She folded her hands in her lap. David, there's a difference between exposing a man and inviting him to remember something he lost. I intend to do the second thing. Whether he hears it that way is entirely up to him. And if the board decides to use the deed against him, if this becomes bigger than either of us wants it to be, Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then that will be the consequence of choices that were made long before I ever walked through those doors, she said. I can't control what people do with the truth once it's spoken. I can only make sure it finally gets spoken. David nodded, understanding, and the two of them sat together in that small motel room for a while longer, saying little else, simply sharing the particular, quiet solidarity of two people about to do something neither could fully predict the outcome of. Tomorrow, on the 10th anniversary stage, in front of 3,000 people and 40,000 more online, avoidance was going to run out completely. The truth will set you free. Nobody in that sanctuary knew how true that sentence was about to become. For Eleanor, and, eventually, even for Jonathan himself. Sunday morning arrived bright and cold. Grace Harbor's sanctuary was packed beyond capacity. Extra chairs lining the side aisles, an overflow room set up in the fellowship hall with a live stream screen, 42,000 people tuning in online, curious, after a week of viral controversy, to see how the redemption would play out. The Whitmore group sat in the front row, exactly where Richard had planned. Eleanor Whitfield sat 2 rows behind them, in a modest navy dress David had helped her find, her hands folded calmly in her lap, looking, for all the world, like any other quiet, dignified older woman attending church. Jonathan opened the service warmly, thanking the congregation for 10 remarkable years, previewing the exciting announcement about the campus expansion still to come. Then, exactly as Richard had scripted, he turned toward Eleanor's row with practiced humility. Before we continue, he said, his voice carrying that same syrup warmth from the week before, I want to address something publicly that weighs heavily on my heart. Last Sunday, we made a mistake. A woman who simply wanted to worship with us was turned away, and that never should have happened. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, would you please stand? Eleanor stood slowly. The congregation applauded. Warm, relieved applause, the kind that wants a story to have a tidy ending. Mrs. Whitfield, Jonathan continued, on behalf of this entire congregation, I want to personally apologize, and invite you to say a few words, if you'd like. He gestured toward a small handheld microphone an usher was already carrying toward her. Exactly 2 minutes, Richard had instructed. Then a smooth transition into the campus announcement. Eleanor took the microphone. The sanctuary quieted. Thank you, Pastor Jonathan, she said, her voice steady, carrying easily through the sound system despite its softness. I appreciate the apology. I truly do. Richard, standing just off stage, allowed himself a small, relieved exhale. But before I sit back down, Eleanor continued, I'd like to share something about this building that I don't think many of you know. Richard's relief evaporated instantly. 34 years ago, Eleanor said, my husband, Samuel Whitfield, owned this land. He wasn't a wealthy man. He was a carpenter. But he believed so deeply in a young preacher's vision for a church that welcomed everyone, truly everyone, no exceptions, that he gave this land away and spent 2 years of his life building the very sanctuary you are sitting in right now, with his own 2 hands. A ripple of stunned murmurs moved through the crowd. Jonathan's smile had frozen in place. He wrote one condition into that gift, Eleanor continued, pulling a folded, brittle piece of paper from her handbag. The original deed, which David had carefully photocopied and returned to the archive, though the original now traveled with her. A condition that this church would never, under any circumstance, turn away a person seeking to worship because of their poverty or their appearance. She unfolded the paper. Last Sunday, I was that person. I was turned away. Not because I caused a disturbance, not because I was dangerous, but because I did not look like the kind of guest this church wanted the cameras and the investors to see. The Whitmore Group representatives in the front row exchanged uneasy glances. I'm not here today for an apology, Eleanor said, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with the full weight of 34 years finally being spoken aloud. I'm not here to take back this building, though the deed my husband signed does legally allow for exactly that, should this condition ever be broken. I loved this church too much for that. Then and now. She looked directly at Jonathan. I came here today because I wanted this congregation, this beautiful, faithful congregation who show up every week trusting that what's Terhawish, preached from this pulpit is what's Diraj, to know the truth about the ground beneath their feet. It was built by people who had nothing, for people who had nothing, so that no one, ever, would have to feel what I felt walking out those doors last Sunday. The sanctuary was utterly silent. Somewhere in the third row, David Reyes stood, tears streaming freely down his face, unable and unwilling to hide them. Richard Cole moved quickly toward the stage, gesturing urgently at the sound booth, mouthing, "Cut to the video! Cut to the video!" to a technician who, for the first time in his career, chose not to follow instructions, staring instead at Eleanor with the same stunned stillness as everyone else in the building. The campus announcement video sat ready, and unplayed on a laptop no one was going to touch. A woman in the third row, a longtime member named Grace Tomlinson, who had attended Grace Harbor since Pastor Elias's days, rose slowly to her feet and began, quietly at first, then louder, to clap. Not the polite, relieved applause from a few minutes earlier, but something else entirely. Recognition, grief, and something like gratitude, all tangled together. Others rose with her, not in celebration exactly, but in acknowledgement. The way a congregation stands for a hymn, it suddenly remembers all the words to. Somewhere near the back, an elderly usher who had worked security for over a decade quietly lowered his head, remembering, with sudden shame, every person he had ever been instructed to relocate without a second thought. Jonathan Myers stood frozen at the pulpit, the microphone he was no longer holding somehow feeling like the only honest thing left in the room. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. This was the moment the sermon Jonathan had planned collided, completely, with the sermon the truth demanded. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. Then Jonathan Myers did something none of his media training, none of Richard Cole's careful scripts, had prepared him for. He stepped down from the platform. He walked, slowly, across the stage floor, past the stunned worship team, past Richard Cole's frantic, silent, gesturing for him to return to the podium, and transition to the scheduled announcement, and stopped in front of Eleanor Whitfield. "You knew my father," he said quietly, the microphone still clipped to his lapel, carrying his words to every screen in the building, whether he wanted it to or not. "I did," Eleanor said. "He was a good man, Jonathan. He carried the weight of this promise every single day of his ministry. He prayed for you by name every Sunday, before anyone else arrived, asking that you would one day understand what this church was really for." Jonathan's composure, the composure of a man who had built an entire career on never letting his face show what he felt, finally, completely, broke. "He never told me your name," Jonathan said, his voice cracking. "He never told me any of this. I signed papers referencing some old covenant, and I told my lawyers not to worry about it, because I didn't know." "I believe you," Eleanor said gently, and something in her gentleness was almost harder to bear than anger would have been. "I don't think you woke up one day and decided to become a man who turns away the poor, Jonathan. I think you inherited a church and a promise, without ever being handed the story behind either one. That's not entirely your fault." "Then whose fault is it?" Jonathan asked, and for the first time since anyone in that sanctuary had known him, he sounded genuinely lost. "It's nobody's fault, and it's everybody's responsibility," Eleanor said. "Your father meant to tell you. He ran out of time. But you, Jonathan, you had the deed in your own hands. You had lawyers flag the covenant, and you told them not to worry about it. Somewhere, some part of you already knew there was something in this building's history you didn't want to look at too closely. That part is yours to own." Richard Cole, watching from the wings, understood with sudden, sinking clarity that there was no script that could salvage this moment, and made the decision, cold and pragmatic, even now, to quietly signal the sound booth to cut the live stream feed. It was too late. The moment had already reached 42,000 screens, and was already being clipped, shared, and re-uploaded faster than any statement his team could draft. Richard tried one last time, striding toward the stage with a tight, professional smile still somehow fixed on his face. "Folks, let's give Pastor Jonathan and Mrs. Whitfield a round of applause. And we'll continue with, 'Sit down, Richard.'" The voice came from the third row. Walter Higgins, the old elder, standing now, his voice carrying a quiet authority that decades of boardroom experience had apparently never managed to erode from Richard's calculations. "I think everyone here would like to hear the rest of what this woman has to say." Richard opened his mouth, glanced at the sea of faces now watching him instead of the stage, and, for possibly the first time in his professional life, found no strategy available to him. He stepped back. Jonathan, still facing Eleanor, seemed almost unaware that the rest of the building existed at all. "What do you want?" Jonathan asked Eleanor, his voice barely above a whisper now, the cameras and the congregation and the Whitmore group all fading into irrelevance around the two of them. "What can I possibly do to make this right?" Eleanor considered the question for a long moment. "I don't want your money," she said. "I don't want your apology posts or your gift baskets. I want you to go back and actually read the sermon you preached last week, the one about the least one of these, and I want you to ask yourself, honestly, in front of God and this congregation, whether you've been building a house of worship or a house of appearances." She held out the folded deed toward him. "This belongs to this church's history, not to a courtroom," she said. "I'm not here to take the building. I never was. I'm here to ask you to remember what it was built for. Whether you choose to is between you, your congregation, and God. That's not something I, or anyone else, can decide for you." Jonathan took the paper with trembling hands, and for the first time in a decade, standing in the church his father built and he had reshaped beyond recognition, Jonathan Myers had absolutely nothing to say. He turned, slowly, to face the congregation, 3,000 faces in the sanctuary, 42,000 more, watching from wherever they sat, with their phones and their laptops, all of them waiting to see what their pastor would do with the truth, now that it had nowhere left to hide. "My father built this church on a promise," Jonathan said finally, his voice rough, stripped of every polished cadence he'd spent a decade perfecting. "I forgot that promise. Not because I'm a monster, though today, I understand why some of you might think that, but because somewhere along the way, I decided that growing this church mattered more than keeping faith with the reason it existed in the first place. I don't have a redemption speech prepared for this moment. I don't have a strategy. I just have the truth, which is that I am deeply, deeply sorry, and I don't yet know what I'm going to do to make it right. But I intend to find out." It was, David would later reflect, the first completely unscripted thing he had ever heard Jonathan Myers say from that pulpit, and somehow, despite everything, the most honest sermon of his entire career. You reap whatever you sow. Karma, in this story, did not arrive as lightning or scandal alone. It arrived as consequence, slow, layered, and entirely self-authored. The fallout began within hours. The Whitmore group withdrew from the campus expansion deal by Monday morning, their representative citing, in careful corporate language, concerns about alignment between the organization's stated values and its operational practices. The $40 million deal Jonathan and Richard had spent 18 months courting evaporated in a single weekend. Richard Cole resigned from the board by Wednesday, releasing a brief statement distancing himself entirely from decisions made regarding guest experience protocols, a final, cowardly act of self-preservation that fooled almost no one, given the protocols bore his fingerprints from the beginning. The Board of Elders, several of whom had quietly harbored their own discomfort with the church's direction for years, called an emergency session Thursday evening. David Reyes was asked to speak, and, for the first time in his life, stood in front of church leadership and told the complete, unflinching truth about everything he had witnessed over the past several years: the guest experience protocols, the quiet redirecting of undesirable visitors, the shrinking benevolence fund, the anonymous donation that had stopped the same month Eleanor lost her apartment. That last detail landed heaviest of all, because, when the church's financial records were finally properly audited, they revealed something nobody, not even Eleanor herself, had fully known. The anonymous donor labeled, a friend of the founder, the one who had quietly funded the benevolence fund for 15 years, was Eleanor Whitfield herself, giving away what little she had, month after month, to a church that would one day turn her away at its doors, never once revealing who she was, never once asking for recognition, right up until her own finances collapsed, and she had nothing left to give at all. When this detail became public, it did more to expose the truth of Grace Harbor's drift than any deed or any confrontation could have. The woman the church had escorted out into the cold had for 15 years been quietly keeping its charitable heart beating. The board voted, unanimously, to place Jonathan Myers on an indefinite leave of absence pending a full review of the church's practices, culture, and leadership, not a firing. Not yet, but a reckoning. The first real consequence Jonathan Myers had faced in over a decade of unchecked growth. His wife, Claire, who had watched the unraveling from the front row that Sunday with an expression David would later describe as devastated but unsurprised, filed for a legal separation 2 weeks later, not solely because of Eleanor, David would learn, but because Eleanor's confrontation had simply been the final, undeniable proof of a slow erosion Claire had been quietly grieving inside their marriage for years. A husband who had stopped being the man she married and become, instead, a brand. "I kept waiting for him to come back," Claire told David once, in a brief, tearful conversation weeks later. "The man my husband used to be. I think that Sunday, watching Eleanor speak, I finally understood he wasn't coming back on his own. Something had to force it." Richard Cole's fall was, in its own way, the quietest and most complete of all. Without Grace Harbor's platform behind him, the real estate ventures he's daily been quietly courting on the side, using the church's donor network as a source of introductions, began to fall apart, one uncomfortable phone call at a time. 2 other nonprofit boards he sat on, wary of the scandal, declined to renew his positions. Within a year, the man who had once spoken of brand alignment and guest experience protocols in gleaming conference rooms was working a modest sales job 2 towns over, largely forgotten by the very donor class he had spent so long trying to impress. Jonathan's reckoning was slower and stranger than anyone expected. In the first weeks of his leave of absence, he tried, out of old habit, to manage the narrative, drafting a heartfelt open letter, considering a tell-all interview, calling a crisis consultant recommended by a colleague at another megachurch. But something in him kept stalling. He would sit down to write and find himself, instead, rereading old sermons his father had preached decades earlier from a box of cassette tapes he found in his mother's garage, listening to Elias's plain, unpolished voice talk about grace as though it were a verb, not a brand. It was in that box that he finally found the letter, the one David had discovered months earlier, but never had the chance to deliver, forwarded quietly to Jonathan's home by the church's here as interim administrator during the records reorganization that followed the scandal. He read it alone, late one night, in the same study where he'd once toasted a photograph of his father and told it, quietly, that it would have hated everything he'd built. The letter was short. It said, in Elias's shaking, late-life handwriting, that he was sorry he might run out of time to explain everything himself, that the land Grace Harbor stood on had been a gift from 2 people who owned almost nothing and gave it anyway, that the deed's condition wasn't a legal formality, but the entire point of the church's existence, and that if Jonathan ever forgot that point, he should go and find Eleanor Whitfield, wherever she was, and ask her to remind him. Jonathan sat with that letter for a long time. Then, for the first time since his father's funeral, he allowed himself to cry. Not performed grief for cameras, not a curated vulnerability moment for a sermon series, but the plain, unglamorous grief of a son who realized, far too late, exactly what his father had been trying to hand him all along. Jonathan Myers lost, in the span of 3 weeks, the deal that would have defined his legacy, the board's confidence, his public reputation, and his marriage. But karma, in this story, was never meant to simply punish. It was meant, in its slow and unglamorous way, to clear space for something to actually grow back. Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me." The verse that opened this story is the same verse that closes it. But by the end, everyone finally understood what it actually meant. 6 months later, Grace Harbor Church looked different. Not smaller in spirit, though certainly humbler in ambition. The $40 million campus expansion had been permanently shelved. In its place, the board approved something far less glamorous and far more faithful to the original deed: a full renovation of the Benevolence Fund, a dedicated year-round shelter partnership, and a standing policy, written into the church's bylaws this time, not just a promise whispered between two men 30 years ago, guaranteeing that no visitor would ever again be asked to leave based on appearance or means. David Reyes, promoted by the new interim leadership to Director of Community Outreach, oversaw the launch of a small, unglamorous program that quietly meant more to him than anything else he'd canes: a partnership with local shelters, ensuring that anyone in need who walked through Grace Harbor's doors was met not with a gift bag and a gentle redirection, but with an actual seat, an actual meal, and an actual welcome. He named the program, with the board's unanimous approval, Samuel's Promise. Eleanor Whitfield, who had initially resisted any public recognition, finally agreed, reluctantly, and only after David's persistent, gentle insistence, to have her name added to a small plaque near the sanctuary doors, not celebrating her as a hero, but simply stating the truth that had been buried for over 3 decades. This building was built in 1992 by Samuel and Eleanor Whitfield, who gave everything they had so that everyone, regardless of what they have, would always have a place here. Jonathan Myers did not disappear from the story entirely, though for a long time, David wasn't sure whether that was a mercy or a further complication. After his leave of absence, Jonathan did not return to the pulpit. He stepped down permanently, choosing instead, quietly, without cameras, without a media strategy, to spend 18 months volunteering at the very shelter on 5th Street he had once suggested Eleanor be sent to, doing the unglamorous work of serving meals and stocking supplies, work with no stage and no applause. He and Eleanor met again, months later, at that shelter, entirely by chance. Their conversation was brief and private, and neither ever fully shared its contents. But David noticed, in the weeks that followed, a change in Jonathan he hadn't seen in years. A quietness, a humility, the faint outline of the boy his father used to kneel down to and speak to at eye level, slowly, imperfectly, beginning to reappear. Miriam Okafor, the retired administrative assistant who had once tried and failed to tell Jonathan the truth after his father's funeral, was invited back by the new interim leadership to help rebuild the church's community archive, this time with Jonathan himself, humbled and largely unrecognized by the wider public now, quietly volunteering afternoons to help catalog decades of forgotten photographs, letters, and records. It was, Miriam told David once with a small private smile, the closest thing to an apology that man has left in him, and somehow, it's enough. Claire did not reconcile with Jonathan, though the two remained, against most expectations, cautiously civil, even kind, co-parenting the quiet, unglamorous rebuilding of 2 separate lives, instead of the shared, curated one they had performed for a decade. "I don't think I lost my marriage that Sunday," Claire told David once, near the end of that difficult year. "I think I finally got to see clearly what had already been lost, a long time before anyone said it out loud." On the 1-year anniversary of the Sunday Eleanor Whitfield was expelled from Grace Harbor Church, the congregation gathered again, smaller this time, no live-stream cameras, no investors in the front row, no $40 million renderings pinned to any wall. David Reyes stood at the same pulpit where Jonathan had once preached about the least of these, and where Eleanor had once taken a borrowed microphone to speak an unplanned truth. He looked out at a congregation that had, slowly and imperfectly, begun rebuilding itself around the promise it had almost forgotten. "A year ago," David said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "a woman named Eleanor Whitfield stood right about where I'm standing and reminded all of us what this building was actually built for. She didn't do it with anger. She didn't do it for revenge. She did it because she still believed, after everything, that this church could become what her husband once dreamed it would be." He looked toward the back row, where Eleanor sat, No longer in a torn gray coat, but still, by choice, in the same modest seat she had once been asked to leave. Church, David said, echoing words he'd heard 100 times growing up in this building, finally understanding them completely. Whatever you do for the least of these, you don't just do it for them. You do it for the God who's watching every single door you open and every single door you close. Eleanor Whitfield, sitting quietly in the back row of the church her husband built with his own 2 hands, closed her eyes, not in sorrow this time, but in something that, after 34 long years, finally felt like peace. Outside, the late afternoon sun caught the golden cross above the entrance, the same cross Samuel had insisted be simple, unadorned, visible from the road, so that anyone walking by, no matter how far they've fallen, knows exactly where the doors are. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, those doors meant precisely what he'd always intended them to mean.
Moral of the story. The tale reminds us that real compassion is demonstrated in our deeds, not only in our words. It reminds us that every person, independent of social standing, riches, or appearance, is due respect, compassion, and dignity. Judging others based on appearance can cause us to make unjust and hurtful mistakes. Helping those in need and treating everyone fairly can show real faith and decent character. The pastor's error demonstrated that honesty, humility, and love for others should always take precedence to success, wealth, and recognition. Eleanor's patience, forgiveness, and bravery showed the real meaning of compassion and encouraged others to change. This narrative exhorts us to always remember that even the most underprivileged or most abandoned individual deserves compassion and respect, remain true to our principles, and advocate what is right. In the end, real truth and honesty always show forth more than money, influence, or looks.